My name is Dr. Elise Navarro, and I used to believe that some losses were too complete to leave any trace behind, that when someone you love vanishes without explanation, they take every possibility of connection with them into whatever void has claimed them. I thought that disappearance was the cruelest form of death because it offers no closure, no certainty, no grave to visit when the weight of missing them becomes unbearable. I was wrong. Some losses don't disappear completely. They transform, finding new forms to inhabit, new ways to reach across the impossible distance between the missing and the left behind. It had been raining for 17 hours straight when she came into my life. Not the dramatic downpour that announces itself with thunder and wind, but the kind of relentless drizzle that turns the world into watercolor, blurring all the sharp edges until everything becomes soft and uncertain. I'd been standing at the reception window of my rural clinic for most of that time, watching the rain as if it might eventually return what it had taken from me exactly 12 months earlier. My son Gabriel had disappeared during a thunderstorm on a night that had started like any other. 17 years old, artistic, given to long walks when he needed to think through whatever adolescent crisis was occupying his mind that week. He'd kissed my forehead after dinner, said he was going to sketch by the creek, and walked out into weather that would have kept most teenagers indoors. We found his sketchbook the next morning, soaked and ruined, but Gabriel himself had simply vanished as if the storm had reached down and plucked him from the earth. The investigation had consumed months of our lives, producing nothing but questions that grew more painful with each repetition. No signs of struggle, no indication of where he might have gone or why he might have wanted to disappear. Just absence where presence should have been, silence where his laughter used to echo through our house. My husband David had handled the uncertainty by leaving, unable to live in the space between hope and despair that had become our daily reality. I'd handled it by throwing myself into veterinary work, caring for animals who couldn't disappear without trace, whose needs were immediate and solvable in ways that missing children's needs are not. The call came at 3:47 p.m. from Father Michael at St. Augustine's, the small stone church that served our rural community with quiet dignity and patient faith. His voice carried the particular quality of confusion that I'd heard too often in the past year, the tone people used when describing something that didn't fit their understanding of how the world was supposed to work. "Dr. Navarro, there's a dog in our parking lot. Been there since this morning, just standing in the rain. She's not hiding from it, not seeking shelter. Just standing there like she's waiting for something. Mrs. Henderson tried to approach her with food, but the strangest thing happened. The rain around the dog seemed different, slower somehow, like it was falling through thicker air. I should have suggested he call animal control or the county shelter, should have explained that I was barely managing my existing caseload and wasn't equipped to handle another complicated rescue. But something in his description resonated with the hollow space Gabriel's absence had carved in my chest. And I found myself grabbing my emergency kit and heading for the truck before I'd consciously decided to respond. The drive to St. Augustine's took 11 minutes through streets that had become rivers, past houses whose windows glowed like lighthouse beacons in the gray afternoon. When I pulled into the church parking lot, I saw her immediately. A medium-sized dog with white fur marked by gray patches that looked like storm clouds, standing perfectly motionless near the edge of the lot where the asphalt met the grass. As I approached through the rain, I noticed something that made my steps slow and my breath catch. The precipitation around her wasn't falling normally. It seemed to hang in the air for a moment before touching down, as if gravity worked differently in her immediate vicinity. She didn't look up when I called to her, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. Her head was bowed, her gaze fixed on the puddles forming at her feet, as if she were reading messages written in the patterns of rainwater. "Hey there, girl," I said softly, stopping about 10 feet away. "What are you looking for out here?" She didn't respond to my voice, didn't show any of the typical signs of awareness that characterized most animal encounters. Instead, she continued to stare into the water below her, so still that she seemed more like a statue than a living creature. When I moved closer, I realized that she wasn't shivering despite being thoroughly soaked, wasn't showing any of the discomfort that should have accompanied prolonged exposure to cold rain. It took nearly an hour of patient coaxing to convince her to come with me, and even then, she moved with reluctance, turning back frequently to look at the spot where she'd been standing, as if she were leaving something precious behind. During the drive back to my clinic, she pressed herself against the carrier window that faced the direction we'd come from, her eyes fixed on the storm with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. I named her Circe, though I couldn't have explained the choice beyond an intuitive sense that she carried mysteries in her bearing that ordinary names couldn't contain. Back at the clinic, her behavior continued to defy normal patterns of canine psychology. She refused food and water, seemed incapable of rest, and positioned herself at the front of her kennel whenever rain began to fall, pressing against the bars as if she were trying to return to whatever vigil I'd interrupted. For 5 days, she maintained this impossible routine, surviving without sustenance in ways that challenged everything I'd learned about animal physiology. Her vital signs remained stable, her alertness sharp, but she seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation, waiting for something I couldn't identify or provide. It was during a routine physical examination, as I tried to assess the minor skin inflammation I'd noticed on her hindquarters, that I discovered something that shattered my understanding of what was possible in the natural world. When I lifted her tail to examine the affected area more closely, my hands began to shake so violently that I had to step back from the examination table. Etched into the skin beneath her tail, where no marking should ever appear, was a series of symbols that made my knees weaken and my breath catch in my throat. Not scars from injury, not tattoos applied by human hands, but engravings that seemed to have grown from within her tissue, raised slightly above the surrounding skin and pulsing with their own faint luminescence. The central image was a perfect spiral, identical to the storm pattern Gabriel had drawn in his final sketch, the one I'd found on his bedroom desk the morning after he'd disappeared. The lines curved and intersected with mathematical precision, creating a pattern that seemed to move when observed directly, drawing the eye inward toward its center where a series of numbers had been inscribed with impossible clarity. Gabriel's birth date, exact to the day, month, and year. I collapsed to the clinic floor, my hand pressed against my mouth to stifle the sound that wanted to escape, something between a sob and a scream. This wasn't coincidence or wishful thinking or the kind of meaningful pattern that grief-stricken minds impose on random events. This was deliberate, intentional, a message that had been carried across impossible distances by a messenger who shouldn't exist. Circe turned slowly to face me, and for the first time since I'd found her, she made direct eye contact. No fear in her gaze, no uncertainty, only a kind of infinite knowing that seemed to reach beyond the physical world into territories I'd never imagined. She looked at me the way Gabriel used to when he'd figured out the answer to a puzzle I didn't even know we were solving, with patience and love, and the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd finally found what they'd been searching for. That night, I abandoned any pretense of professional distance and stayed beside her kennel, whispering prayers and theories and desperate questions into the darkness of the empty clinic. Circe responded by pressing against the kennel bars and allowing me to touch her head, the first physical contact she'd accepted since I'd found her. As my fingers traced the soft fur between her ears, rain began to fall again, harder than it had in days, drumming against the clinic windows with a rhythm that sounded almost like communication. The electrical anomalies started that same evening. Lights flickering in patterns that seemed too regular to be random power fluctuations, monitoring equipment registering spikes and signals that corresponded to no input I could identify. But most unsettling of all were the footsteps I heard in the hallway during the late hours when the clinic should have been empty, except for the two of us. Soft sounds that seemed to circle the building before fading into silence. On the third night of my vigil beside her kennel, something happened that changed everything I thought I knew about the boundary between the living and the lost. I was dozing fitfully in my chair when a whisper penetrated my consciousness, not spoken aloud but heard directly inside my mind with a clarity that made my own thoughts seem dim by comparison. "Mom." I jerked awake, my heart hammering against my ribs, and looked around the darkened clinic for the source of that impossible voice. Circe was sitting perfectly upright in her kennel, her eyes reflecting the emergency lighting with an intensity that made them seem to glow from within. As I stared at her in wonder and terror, I heard it again, Gabriel's voice speaking inside my head, with the same gentle tone he'd used when trying to comfort me during difficult times. "I'm okay, Mom. Don't be afraid." I wept until dawn, my tears falling onto Circe's fur as she pressed against the kennel bars and allowed me to hold on to her like an anchor in a storm of grief and impossible hope. Whatever she was, however she'd found me, she carried within her some fragment of my lost son, some essence that death or disappearance hadn't been able to claim completely. Over the following days, her behavior became increasingly responsive to stimuli connected to Gabriel's memory. She would lift her head when I played recordings of thunderstorms, would approach the kennel door when I showed her photographs from his childhood, would lay across his old hoodie for hours when I brought it from home. But it was during the next major storm that her true purpose became clear. As the thunder rolled across the valley and lightning illuminated the clinic windows, Cersei rose from her usual position and faced the eastern wall, the same direction Gabriel had been walking when he'd vanished into that terrible night. She stood at attention like a soldier receiving orders, her body rigid with purpose, and I understood that she wasn't just carrying his memory. She was carrying a mission. A week later, a man in a black coat appeared at my clinic during evening hours, introducing himself as a researcher with a weather anomaly investigation firm I'd never heard of. He was polite but persistent, asking questions about unusual animal behavior during recent storms, particularly about a dog that had been photographed walking through lightning strikes without apparent harm. He showed me a security camera image that made my blood freeze. It was clearly Cersei, standing in the middle of a parking lot while electrical discharge forked around her like she was generating her own electromagnetic field. But the timestamp on the photograph was dated 5 years before Gabriel was born. I asked him to leave, my voice steadier than I'd expected, and he complied without argument. But he left behind a business card with no name, just a phone number and a symbol that made my hands shake when I recognized it. The same spiral pattern I'd found etched beneath Cersei's tail. That night, I dreamed of Gabriel for the first time since his disappearance. Not the nightmares of searching and calling his name that had plagued my sleep for months, but a peaceful vision of him walking through gentle rain with Cersei at his side. But in the dream, she wasn't the damaged, mysterious creature I'd found in that church parking lot. She was larger, brighter, moving with the confidence of a guide rather than the patience of a guardian. When I woke, Cersei was no longer in her kennel. I found her standing at the clinic's front door, staring out into the rain that had begun falling again during the night. Her posture was different now, no longer the defeated stance of an animal in mourning, but something that spoke of purpose and possibility. "Where are you trying to take me?" I whispered, my hand resting on the door handle. She turned to look at me, wagged her tail once in a gesture that somehow conveyed both invitation and reassurance, then stepped out into the storm. I followed without hesitation, leaving behind the safety of known spaces to walk into weather that felt charged with more than mere electricity. The rain didn't touch me as we walked through the empty streets of our small town, past houses where families slept peacefully, unaware that impossible things were moving through their world. Cersei led me with confident steps toward the creek where Gabriel's sketchbook had been found, but instead of stopping at the familiar location, she continued deeper into the woods, following paths that seemed to materialize beneath our feet. We walked for what felt like hours through a landscape that grew increasingly strange and beautiful, where the rain fell upward as often as down, and the trees whispered in languages I'd never heard but somehow understood. Cersei moved ahead of me with the steady pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going, occasionally turning back to ensure I was still following, her eyes holding depths that reflected not just the storm around us, but something that looked remarkably like starlight. Eventually, we reached a clearing I'd never seen before, despite decades of living in the area, a circular space where the grass grew in perfect spirals, and the air hummed with energy that made my skin tingle, and my heart race with anticipation rather than fear. In the center of the clearing stood Gabriel, not as the 17-year-old who'd vanished into that storm, but as something more complete, more fully himself than he'd ever been in life. He looked exactly as I remembered him, but somehow more vivid, more present, as if the physical world had only been a rough draft of who he was meant to become. When he smiled at me, I felt the year of grief and searching and desperate hope finally transform into something that resembled peace. "I've been waiting for you to find me," he said, his voice carrying across the space between us with perfect clarity. "But I couldn't come back the way I left. I needed help." And she answered. Cersei walked to his side and sat down, no longer the mysterious stray who'd appeared in that church parking lot, but revealed as the guide she'd always been, the bridge between the world of the living and whatever realm had claimed my son. She looked at me with eyes that held infinite patience and love, and I understood that she'd spent months preparing me for this moment, teaching me to trust in possibilities that defied everything I thought I knew about life and death and the boundaries between them. "Where have you been?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be more complex than any simple geographical location. "Learning," Gabriel said, his hand resting on Cersei's head. "There are places where the rain goes when it falls, Mom. Places where lost things gather and wait for the right time to return. I couldn't come back alone, but she knew how to build a bridge." As he spoke, I began to understand that his disappearance hadn't been an ending, but a transformation. That he'd somehow found his way to spaces that existed parallel to our physical world, reachable only by those who knew the proper frequencies, and possessed the courage to step outside conventional reality. But I also understood that this reunion, beautiful as it was, couldn't last in any form that resembled normal life. Gabriel belonged to the storm now, to the spaces between raindrops where consciousness could exist without being constrained by flesh and bone. He'd found a way to reach across that distance to say goodbye properly, to let me know that love transcends even the most complete forms of loss. "I have to go back," he said, reading the question in my eyes before I could voice it. "But now you know I'm not really gone, and she'll stay with you for as long as you need her." Cersei approached me then and pressed her warm weight against my legs, and I felt something shift inside my chest. The hollow space Gabriel's disappearance had carved beginning to fill with a different kind of presence. Not his physical return, which I now understood had never been possible, but the certainty that love finds ways to persist even when everything else falls away. The clearing began to fade as the storm moved on, taking Gabriel with it back to whatever realm he'd learned to call home. But Cersei remained solid and real beside me. No longer a mystery to be solved, but a gift to be treasured. A living reminder that some connections are strong enough to survive any distance, any transformation, any redefinition of what it means to exist. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in my clinic with rain still drumming against the windows, and Cersei sitting patiently beside me. But everything had changed. The year-long ache of not knowing had been replaced by the bittersweet comfort of understanding, and the silence that had filled my house since Gabriel's disappearance no longer felt empty but expectant, full of possibilities I was only beginning to comprehend. Cersei looked up at me with eyes that held the memory of starlight and storms, and I knew that our story together was just beginning. She'd brought me the greatest gift imaginable. The knowledge that love doesn't end when life does, that some bonds are strong enough to reshape reality itself, and that sometimes the most profound truths are delivered by messengers who appear first as strays wandering through rain, carrying secrets that can heal the deepest wounds if we have the courage to trust in impossible things. The rain would continue to fall, as it always had and always would. But now when I stood at my window watching it transform the world into watercolor, I wouldn't be waiting for it to return what it had taken. I'd be listening for the whispers it carried, the messages that travel on frequencies only the heart can hear, the proof that some gifts are too precious to be lost completely, even when they have to find new forms to inhabit in order to reach us again.